You can also adjust it somewhat. You can adjust it.
No. Hey, how do you know? Go to here. Okay, great. Okay, that's fine. Trying to find a way I can get that.
Just forget about it.
Yeah, that's right.
At least
Hello, good morning. Sorry if it's too loud and I just turn it slow or something. So I'm really happy to present or to announce Raji. I know Raji for a long time. I worked for almost maybe 4 years together, very closely together with her at Broadwood Park. We were both teachers there. And Raji did a PhD in Canada, I believe, or in the United States. And then was a teacher at the school in Madras, Krishnamurti School in Madras. Then was a teacher at the Krishnamurti School in Broadwood for several years. And is now professor in Wisconsin, in the cold part of the United States. And she's going to present something on holistic education.
Sounds good, yes. Thank you. So I'm going to do this with slides. So hello everybody. I think Yap said it all actually, and I'm sure I will tell you more about myself as we get further through these slides. So I want to begin by giving you a little story, which is a little bit of history actually. In 1912, in Chicago, there was a factory inspector by the name of Helen Todd. And she went to factories where children were working and she decided to interview them. And she said to them, if you did not have to work in a factory, and if your father really earned a lot of money, what would you choose to do? Would you go to school, or would you still work in a factory? 412 children out of the 500 told her, I would rather be in the factory. And, you know, it's shocking when you think about it. And then they said, and she said, well, why? So they said, well, they don't holler at you, you know, in the factory, they would holler at me in the school. You know, at the end of the month, I work, and at the end of the month, I get this card, and it says, you didn't do any good. So then I would take that home, and what's the use of me doing that? Here at least I get $6 every month. And third person said, well, you know, I actually got a card. I worked and it said excellent. And I went home and gave it to my mother, and she put it in a Bible. And that was that. We didn't have anything to eat that day, so why bother, right? And somebody else said that, look, we were really, I think it's very boring and horrible, and the kids holler at you as well, so I don't want to go to school. The interesting part is, this happened in 1912, and now we're in 2012, and it's not that different when you talk to young people as to what are the reasons that you want to drop out of school, or why did you end up not finishing school? And they often say, well, I'm bored, or people yell at me, or it's not a very friendly atmosphere. It's very hostile. So in response to this, to some degree, I think there has been something called alternative education that has sprung up right around the world, and it's been happening for a long time, long before even regular schools. There were like homeschools and all of the kinds of different ways in which education was taking place. But once the public school or the mainstream school came into place, then people began to say, well, there are alternatives. Let's look for alternatives to this really horrible system that's in place, the mainstream system. And I want to actually draw a distinction between alternative education and what we call holistic education. So, for example, alternative education can be of several types. The most interesting type is the innovative type. So the innovative school is the creative school, the fun school, the school where kids really want to go, they want to learn, and all those kinds of things, right? But right now in alternative education, when you say, oh yes, I am a teacher at an alternative school, most people will ask you, what do you mean? Because they don't no longer think of the alternative school as the innovative school at all. They really think of it as either a credit model, which is you go there because you really need some credits, and you haven't been very good with your studies, so then you end up going there, and then they give you an accelerated few classes, then you're pushed back to your original school, and then you graduate from there. Or you go to what is the behavior modification model, or the soft jail, which I'm calling the soft jail model, which is, one ends up, many of these kids, they are pushed out of the regular school, and they're told, go to the alternative school, and that is down the road there, and you are not allowed to stand up or sit down without permission. You're not allowed to leave the room without an escort. And there are surveillance cameras everywhere. So that is a kind of school too. So that is the reason why I want to draw a distinction between what we call alternative, because it sort of is an alternative to everything, and it's not always a very good alternative either, although the original idea was that the mainstream isn't working, let's try to find some alternatives, right? So I'm calling, I've put it down there below because I didn't really want to mix it up with the others. So it's really the holistic education model, which I think is a little bit different. So when we think of holistic education, people would normally say, well, what is that? What does it mean? And really, most holistic educators today, or the researchers on holistic education, will tell you that it has to do with more than the physical. This is how we typically describe it and say, oh, it's more than the physical, it's more than the intellectual, it's more than whatever else you can offer, aesthetic. So what is that extra or that more? So in some ways, yesterday, you heard people talking about the integrated model, right? Or, the whole idea of there being no separation, right, between the outer and the inner. So that could be perhaps that extra holistic model, that extra thing that holistic model is also looking at. So I'm just going to give you a short description here. It attempts to nurture the development of the whole person. So, including the intellectual, emotional, physical, social, aesthetic, and the spiritual. So the point of the spiritual is also the wisdom. So let's take, for instance, if we go back to that original idea of what is a creative or an innovative school, I think people, if you think about the 3 T's yesterday, I think we heard from Paul Herder, he was talking about transmission and about transaction, right? And what he meant, and I think what typically people mean is transmission, and today's students would call it downloadable education, right? They say, okay, can I just get it downloaded? And in fact, if you give students a choice, I'm sure they'd love to download it into their brains, although we don't want that as teachers, right? So that would be transmission. Transaction is actually quite innovative. I mean, it has to do with all these different terms you might have heard of: investigative, problem-based learning, right? Or case studies, learning that keeps me active. So all these things would be when you transact something, there's something or somebody you're interacting with. But it's holistic, or the 3rd T, which is transformation or transformational education, which brings in this whole idea of wisdom. And that is what I think sometimes people think of in terms of the heart thinking, right, or the thinking heart. And just to give you a little slide here, in the Chinese lettering, actually, the symbol for the mind is the lettering of the heart. Okay, so that's something I just thought was very interesting when I found that. I was like, oh wow, look at that. So the symbol for the mind is the lettering of the heart. So this is really, and what do we understand by that, right? I think what it means is, now when we think about this, let's think in terms of who are we referring to as holistic educators, right? I mean, what am I really talking about? I think Walt Whitman actually had a very interesting poem, I can find it, which I thought always described what, this whole business of wisdom is all about. And he said, I think it was something like, a child goes forth. I think you know it. Well, I have no idea. Oh yes, okay. There was a child who went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became. And that object became part of him for that day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years. So he's really referring to what I think we call this whole, thing of wisdom education. Or yesterday somebody called it flow, right? Where there is no separation between what the person is learning and what they're learning. So there's that separation ends. So a child went forth, and what the first object he looked upon, that he became, right? And that object became part of him and stayed with him for so many years, or maybe just for that day, right? So what I'm going to do today is just give you a sense of what some holistic educators that I was interested in, and still am very interested in, what they've said and what they've talked about. And I think, in fact, we probably won't be able to do all of them. So I'm just going to give you a little brief idea of Maria Montessori, Rudolf Steiner, and J. Krishnamurti. What is interesting about all three of them is that in some way or another, they were all connected at one time or another in their lives to the Theosophical Society, right? Maria Montessori, went to Adyar and was in the Theosophical Society, I think, from 1939 for a good 7 years or 6 years during the time of the Second World War. She was, and so she held many workshops there. Steiner was in part of Theosophy and then moved away from that, split really, right? And Krishnamurti eventually also split. Okay. But we have three very interesting educators who are in some way connected in that sense. So what do I mean when I say, okay, holistic education? Okay. So some of the things I think that we are interested in is an encounter with depth. So say for instance, or people would say, okay, we are interested in the whole child, not just the brain or not just the body. And if you think about today education, we often in mainstream schools, what are we doing? We're really, you have teachers in charge of the brain and the principals or very often the assistant principals who call themselves the vice principals, and they say we are the principals of vice, really, that's going on in schools, and they are in charge of the bodies, right? So there's a sort of a separation between the mind and the body because the teachers say, well, I don't want to deal with the problems or issues that you may bring into the classroom. I want you to leave and go deal with that because that's where your discipline is going to take place. So there is so the teachers are in charge of the brain and somebody else is in charge of the body. So that's something that the whole child approach completely is different from, right? So holistic educators are very interested in the whole child approach. All of them talk of freedom in some form or another, and we'll see what forms they take, how do they live with freedom. The roles of teachers and the roles of students are also very different, depending on what model you're looking at. So here is a picture I found, by the way, of Maria Montessori. This is Adyar, and the all-cot bungalow. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. And so you can see she did, several fun things. And if you ever go into a Montessori school, and I'm sure many of you have gone there, perhaps you walk in and you see it's very orderly. It's highly orderly. The kids are all doing their own thing. They're very quiet. And I sort of watched them for a few days and had to figure out how do they learn how to do this. They don't really chit-chat and hang out and do those kinds of things unless it's time for them to do it. But there is a certain kind of freedom there as well. And freedom is really one of choice. The teacher doesn't really tell them, look, you do this and then you do that. The teacher just lays out or prepares the environment, something that Maria Montessori was very big on. She said, you need to have a prepared learning environment. So they have a prepared environment, and the kids go around and choose and they figure out what they want to do, and they do it. So that is one of the kinds of freedoms that you find in the Montessori schools. It's not the kind of freedom that Krishnamurti would, necessarily call freedom. Okay, so we'll come to that in a minute. And then we have what nurturing the inner world. So almost all these three people and everyone else typically talks about nurturing the inner world in some way, the inner spirit of the child. And they do it, observation, awareness, these are words that I'm pointing out, but they really have some very specific things that they do. So for example, in a Montessori classroom, a child can go and observe another child working. And they do it very nicely. They just sort of stand to the side and they watch. Or they watch the teacher. And then they play a very interesting game. It's called the silence game. So they try to see how silent they can be. And the teacher is, this is the way they try to create these moments of quiet in a classroom, which we often don't find moments of quiet in, right? So they're really trying to say, well, can we slow down? Can we figure out ways where we can give space You can ask this child to have some space in what they're doing. So they play the silent game, and the silence game is where everybody walks very softly on tiptoes around the classroom. Or the teacher calls their name very softly, so softly that they have to really be very quiet to be able to hear it. So this is one, and we're talking really, young children. So this is some of the ways in which they are sort of exposed, or they're opened up to the possibility of silence in their lives, without silence being thought of as either silencing the person, or oh, it's time for a timeout and you will sit in the corner, which is, which are some of the ways in which one typically thinks of silence, right? But when we talk of holistic education, we're talking of different kinds of silence and a different kind of an opening to the inner self. The relationship between the teacher and the student is one of, they are very, they don't talk about what Kay talks about with regard to authority, right? It is sort of taken for granted to some degree that the teacher will model for the students what needs to be done. But there are other things as well. The student does not have to, the kid does not have to ask for permission to go to the restroom. Okay, which is something, I know it sounds odd, but let me tell you that one of my students who is in higher ed now recounts, she says after going from a Montessori to public school, she got up and left and went to the restroom and came back and got a little slip for detention. And she could never understand that, why that happened. And she said, oh, I didn't realize I had to ask them permission to go down the hall. So you need a pass, right? So it's interesting for people who move from this kind of system to the regular school, and then they find, oh, there are all kinds of new rules I have to deal with. So anyway, then I found, so let's move to Shiner, the Waldorf schools, and guess what I found? I found this picture of Shiner with Annie Besant before they, broke out, I guess, or split. So here is, so one of the things that happens in Waldorf, and I hope I'm not, saying things to all of you that you already know. The main lesson is something that's main, or the important thing in Waldorf schools. In Waldorf, you don't begin to read early. I don't know if you know this, but reading is pushed off to pretty late. Wait till you're at least 7 or 8 years old when you begin to learn how to read. And I have not yet come across a student who has gone through Waldorf who doesn't know how to read. Okay, I really not. I mean, they write very well, they read very well, because when they begin to read, they write their own textbooks in classrooms. They don't have textbooks. They're not given textbooks to read. They write their own. Very often, it's copied from the blackboard. They still have blackboards. They don't have whiteboards, and they are still they draw a lot. Right? One of the things Shiner wanted was imaginative, inquiry or curiosity, and imaginative play. So the kind of freedom, I think that in a Waldorf school, when they say freedom, they're really referring to freedom of the imagination or freedom of being artistic. It is not, again, it's, between the teacher and the student, if you think of the roles of teacher and student, it is pretty directed and directive to some degree. You have one teacher who goes up with you from grade 1 up all the way to grade 8. So it's a real pity if you don't get along with your teacher, right? And you really may have to leave. And these are some real issues that they have at the school. At these Waldorf schools, they actually have these issues, and they say, well, yes, that is something we don't know how to deal with. Because for some reason, because the idea is that it's like having a parent. So you don't get to change your parent, so the same way you don't get to change your teacher. The thing is, of course, the teacher is also supposed to be an expert or can teach almost everything. But as they go up the grades, they sometimes bring in a few specialists. But otherwise, the main lesson is a very interesting lesson because it combines subjects. So it really breaks down these barriers of, are you doing math today? Or are you doing, storytelling? Or what exactly is the main lesson? So they do break down those kinds of disciplinary boundaries when they try to do this. And they too nurture their inner world. And Steiner once said that every classroom should be like breathing. So between breaths, the activities take place, and then there is a moment, or there are times when you should be quiet, when we need some quiet, so that we can actually rest and have that time and then go back into an activity. So you can see that, these are all very different when we're talking about issues of freedom. And of course, now we come to J. Krishnamurti, and since I have been in these schools, I know that we have, as teachers, I think we continue to discuss and think and work and, think about this whole idea of what does freedom mean? And how can we actually make it work? So Krishnamurti wanted, in education, to awaken intelligence. And he said very clearly, these are quotes, that we want to be very sensitive, not to your own desires, but to be sensitive to the world. And that the function of education is to find out how you can live in a totally intelligent way. Okay, so what does this really mean? I think in a Krishnamurti school, very often, in Rockwood at least, and in Chennai, this actually happened around dialogical encounters. So really, most of the time, because remember, Krishnamurti did not leave us with a curriculum like, like say Montessori did, or Waldorf, or Steiner. Right? They're very strict, they're very interesting structured curriculum that is there for Montessori and for Waldorf. But Krishnamurti did not say, here, in first grade you do this, second grade you do that. Right? He didn't say anything of that sort. So typically what happens is that the teachers borrow from all kinds of existing systems, and they innovate and they talk and they create. But the real, I think, encounter, or the real dialogue or questioning really takes place in conversations and through discussions. I think those who are here who are from K school may agree, or there are many things that go on. So questioning is seen as an invitation to possibilities. It's not like, students are expected to question and question together. And the idea of learning together is also very interesting, because here's the thing that Krishnamurti said. He said, sure, you can be a subject matter expert or whatever it is. You can have some subject knowledge. But you really cannot be, let's be clear that you have as much or as little knowledge as anybody else, as your student does when it comes to how to learn to live. Right? So you really don't have that kind of grand wisdom to impart to, the best way to do this is to learn together. So, of course, this leads to very interesting conversations in the Krishnamurti schools, you can just imagine. And the biggest question that comes up is, what is authority? Right? Who has authority? Who are you to tell me what to do? So it's not, they don't quite say it like that, but here's the thing, but there very often, there will be challenges, right? Yes, students will challenge teachers, and teachers will in turn challenge students. And some of the ways in which this takes place, and I'll just give you an example of what I call the agreements meetings in Brockwood. Right? They are very interesting, because every year, at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, especially at the end of the year, you sort of draft out a kind of an agreement as to how you want to live. And the teachers and the students do this together. The first time I attended that meeting, I was like, oh my goodness, what are we doing? What are we really talking about? Oh, this is very interesting, and so on. Then I realized, here's the thing, we always talked about the same kinds of things, which were, students wanted to have the freedom to take off whenever they wanted out of campus, and they were not going to be allowed to do that to some degree. They wanted, some of them would oftentimes, at least at that time, would oftentimes talk about smoking, and some of them would want to talk about, well, what is the reason for this and so on. So, so it was always interesting, because we had some teachers who might be maybe having a glass of wine with their pizza, right? And then you had students who would say, well, if a staff member can have a glass of wine with their pizza, why can't a student who is over the age, 18, have a glass of wine. So this went back and forth, and they're very interesting because many a time I've heard staff members say, okay, I give up, I will not have any wine because I understand that if I do, you are going to ask me this question over and over again. At other times, you have people say, well, you can't drive till you're a certain age, so come on, it's the same thing. So, but there are some very interesting discussions, and what happens in that is, I think what it does is it reinforces a certain sense of community. So it's not that the rules ever really particularly change, I think, if I really think about it. I don't think these agreements change from year to year. But what changes is the way people look at them. And what it does is it reminds people why this is important. And the dialogues are always very different, because different students have different kinds of issues that they want to bring up, right? Or they say, come on, we need to be in the real world too. Why do you want to shelter us here in this way, right? So if you think I cannot make a choice here, well, how would I make a good choice out there? So just let me be, and let me decide whether I want to do this or not, right? That's more of the Summerhill model, right? The Summerhill model says that as long as you can do whatever you want, as long as you do not harm somebody else. So it is freedom, not license. That's what A.S. Neal said very clearly. He said it's freedom, but it's not license. Nobody can do things to others that will harm others. As long as you're clear about that, you can do what you want. You don't have to come in for lessons. In the Krishnamurti school in Rockwood, at least in Rockwood and in Chennai, you cannot not come in for lessons. There are a few times that I have seen students saying, well, I don't feel like going. So oftentimes I think the teachers feel, a certain kind of I could even say pressure to try to innovate in certain ways to invite the students into the classroom. Because you really have to think about, well, how can I engage the students? And how am I going to do it so that they are interested? So what all this leads to is really an encounter with death. And questioning as invitations to dialogue and possibilities. Okay, so I want to just share with you questioning as invitations to dialogue. So there was this child in one of these researchers or holistic educators once talked about this very interesting conversation they had. So in the 50s, there was this young kid who today would be deemed an underachiever, whereas he was really not interested. He was sort of sleeping at the back of the class. But these students were in an elite kind of school, and they were taken to Princeton very often. So they used to go to Princeton, and they used to listen to physicists talking with each other. So, these kids were quite bored, but they would listen, half listen. And one student in particular, and for some reason he is named Gunnar in this, in this particular anecdote. So Gunnar was one of those who was also sleeping, and he suddenly perked up because a student in front of him asked the two physicists who were on stage, what about ghosts? What do you think of ghosts? Okay. So he perked up and he was waiting to hear what these physicists would say. So the two physicists who were talking at that time said, there is no hard evidence, and so we can forget about those. Okay, there's no hard evidence to prove that they exist. Robert Oppenheimer, who was also there, stood up and he said, well, I am open to all possibilities, and that we really need to figure out for our own selves what is that evidence which can either prove or disprove the existence of ghosts, okay, this particular thing. Gunnar was absolutely, inspired and excited and electrified by that, because he realized, oh my goodness, so I don't have to have prepackaged, kinds of ways of thinking about things. I can try to find out for myself. So for him, that really opened up this whole idea of, oh, okay, there is a mystery in life, it's wonderful, there is a wonder in life, and I can actually be responsible and try to figure out what to do about it. So that is really, so for teachers, I think it is oftentimes to think in terms of questioning as an invitation to dialogue. into possibilities. The questions that students ask are not necessarily in order for them to just divert something, but really, maybe this is a chance, a moment in the classroom when you can actually do something about it, which is fantastic, right? The third thing that all holistic educators really talk about is follow the child, which is let's figure out where is the child, what does the child want to do, and how can I follow that particular child? And to avoid othering, and by othering I mean these, yesterday we heard a lot about image making. I think teachers can be as capable of making images of their students as students are capable of doing that to teachers. Right? It's, there's a lot in the literature about bad teacher. There's also, very interestingly, there is a lot, maybe not quite so much, about the so-called bad student. Right? So here's an interesting thing. Sometimes, and this can happen to any teacher, I suspect, all right? So Parker Palmer, in one of his books, talks about what he calls the student from hell, right? So here he went to this nice Midwestern, somewhere college, and he was going to give this wonderful talk. And suddenly at the back of the room, his eye was caught by this one student who was sort of buttoned up and, with his jacket ready to bolt out of the door. And he saw that he was in an anatomically impossible position of being almost parallel to the floor. And he didn't know what to do, and he looked absolutely like he was not interested in anything and was just couldn't make out whether his eyes were closed or open. So what did Parker Palmer do? Like a good teacher, he tried to wake that guy up, right? So the more he tried, the more that student withdrew. So he really tried, and then he says, I think everything was going so well up until that minute that he encountered this one student from hell at the back. And he put all his energy to try to figure out how to get him to engage. So the other 20 people in the classroom completely melted away from his consciousness. He just couldn't, they didn't even exist for him. So he realized, of course, very soon that what he was doing was completely ridiculous. He was getting obsessed with this one student who was not responding at all. And not only that, he had lost all the other 20 because he had no clue what they were doing because he was so focused on this one guy. And he realized this is a real, this is a tragedy, this is not worked, etc. He said, okay, I'm just going to forget about it, put it behind me, go home. Anyway, thank goodness I don't teach her at this place. I'm glad I'm going home. So he gets, he has his quick little reception at the end of the day, and then he's ready for this van to take him to the airport. And he throws his bag and he sits in the van, and the person driving the van is none other than this little guy who was in the back of the room. And he was like, oh God, now I've got to hang out with him for an hour into the airport. So they sit in silence, not talking, nothing, etc. And then suddenly this boy says to him, what do you think? I'm thinking that I should probably, I don't know what to do because, and can you give me some advice? Because my father says I should really quit college and just, get a job because I'm not going to be any good anyway. For Parker Palmer, it was a huge, turning point because he realized, oh my goodness, this kid he looked as if he was completely withdrawing, etc., and he felt that he was responsible, right? I mean, somehow Parker Palmer took it upon himself. He thought, like, I have to reach this kid, and that, he's not getting what I'm saying. The kid was actually involved and wrapped up in his own issues, and he was frightened of a number of other things, like what am I going to do? So he had his own fears. So he says that, if we don't other the child as a teacher, then we can actually probably figure out how to have a conversation. He felt he hadn't done that. He not only lost him, he lost all the other 19 because he just didn't know what he was doing with his life. Folks, and I'll tell you, as a teacher myself, I know this happens. I think every one of us has had, I'm sure, at least somebody in our lives when we felt like, I've just got to try once more to reach this person when we're probably doing it all wrong because we're really trying to hit it with a hammer over the head, right? So teaching is highly complex and highly complicated. So part of this is, nurturing the inner world, incorporating silence or solitude. And the relationship between teachers and students really matters, right? And that relationship keeps changing every day. So I don't think that it is something that is fixed. I think it's very hard to keep it fixed. But for instance, and I'll give you an example, I think this happens sometimes when the student you have a very good relationship with the student and it goes on that way, and suddenly something happens. You may need to take a little bit of space there sometimes, between teacher and student, and say, okay, let's just figure out what's going on. Maybe this is not the best way for us to interact and communicate. We may need to do something a little bit differently. And that happens too, but many times we feel that, oh no, we've had this, so we have to continue exactly in the same way. So I'll give you an example of what I feel is what I think is an encounter with death. Now, I work sometimes, I hang out in a coffee shop, and I'm sort of sitting and doing my writing, and actually somebody from another table who, we've said hello and all the rest of it, came over to me one day and brought a sheet of paper, and I had this. And they said, well, you tell me, you are the professor. It was very clear that I was in for a little bit of a dressing down. So I said, okay, what do you want me to do? You teach teachers? I said, yes. She said, look, my daughter went to first grade, and this was the test that she had. And she had to pick out two things that are alike. So very right. So what do you think, right? What do you think she picked out, and what was she supposed to pick out, right? If you look, yeah, go ahead.
I'm guessing she picked the colors and she was supposed to pick the shapes.
No, actually she did the opposite. She was supposed to pick the colors. And there's a triangle and there's colors, and she picked green and red because she said, and then she got it wrong. So that was the big problem. So I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. So I'm going to go and talk to my teacher, the teachers whom I work with. And I took it to them and I said, well, hey, explain to me why you would, give correct mark for one thing or whatever, give, one of these check marks and a big this for the other. Explain that to me. And the teacher's idea, they were like, what? Why would anybody do that? This is a completely ridiculous, test anyway. And secondly, then they said, oh, no, you can do any of these. So I said, here's what the kid did. And the teacher missed the opportunity for what I think is an encounter with death, which is the child, when you asked her, because, this lady, she said, oh, you must talk to my daughter about it. I said, okay, fine. So I asked the kid, I said, okay, what did you pick? So she said, oh, I picked that and that. I said, okay, why did you do that? So then she says, well, they are like the bases of things, she tells me. They are like the bases of things. They are all, they all have four sides. And that's like the top of something, like a roof. So it sort of, she said, no, this is like the base of a house, and that's like the roof of a house. So I picked these two that were alike. And it was fine. It was really a very interesting conversation to have. And this is what sometimes we miss, right? And I think that teachers sometimes, because of either some kind of, hurry or I really often think that they are all pretty well intentioned. I really don't come across too many teachers who absolutely hate children or something. I think most of them will tell you, oh, I love kids, I want to do what is best for them, etc. But then they are so caught up in the system the way it is that they don't know how to deal with that. So I think, in some ways, holistic schools, independent schools, we are very lucky to be able to, and the students are very lucky to be able to have these encounters with each other. So it's a lot like this diagram, which I actually enjoy, because it tells you that depending on where you sit, your perspective might be totally different. Right? And N can look like a W, could be a 3, could be an E, or an N. So it depends on where one is looking at it from. And we often forget that the student walks into the room with a completely different set of ideas and kinds of things that they bring with them, which is what I refer to as a fund of knowledge that they already have, that they bring into the classroom with. So to not other a student means one really has to figure out what is it that a student knows, what do they want to be excited about, and even the most bored student can really be excited about something. And I would like, actually, in this context, to just show you a very quick little video. Actually, this also happened in one of my classes, but I couldn't find that video, but I found a very similar one. So I'll show you the one that's very similar, which really, again, some of my students teach in schools that are very difficult, lots of constraints and lots of issues. And so some of them were, who said, how am I going to keep kids excited? I don't think the kids know. They don't know much when they come into my classroom. So anyway, they ended up doing something very similar to this. And I think you'll find it quite funny. And the kids became quite excited after that. So let's see. Sorry, this is on somewhere else. Oh, here. Okay, I think it's this. It's just cleaning. Let's see. Right here. I hope this works, but if it doesn't, it's not a big deal.
No pressure.
Yes. Oh. Ooh. Okay, I don't know anything about why this is not. Excuse me, sorry.
You can just see if your sound is turned on.
Here in this, for my son. Oh,
On
yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. Okay.
High-fiving can be one of the most stressful things you ever do in life, but it doesn't have to be. Just remember these simple tips and tricks. Pressure, not too hard and definitely not too soft. Timing, don't start too soon unless you only want a wave in return. You'll know you're in the 5 zone when your partner is roughly the distance you can throw a microwave. Location, basically anywhere is acceptable except for funerals and the bathroom. And watch out for the ball and socket. This is where one partner goes for the high five and the other partner goes for a fist bump. If by chance you're in proximity to the killer, carry an ice pack in the back of your pocket. The style will want to display his strength by slapping your hand as hard as possible. Also, beware the faker. This guy is always looking to fake his way from a high five into a one-way handshake. There's nothing you can really do in this situation, just go with it. If you completely miss, just pretend like you meant to. As far as your partner's concerned, I think it's just one of the crazy things you do. Be prepared to go with the flow. You never know when you might encounter the windmill or the 14th stepper. Mere phone contact will never be enough for this guy. If you feel the need to do the grenade, the Eiffel Tower, the bromance, the jerk, too slow, or the fresh friends, please refrain. Now you're ready for the high five.
So anyway, that was just, just to show you that kids, no matter what you think, I mean, they do know something. So, and they will come up with something very interesting usually. So anyway, that was, I really don't have anything else other than to share with you one, I don't know how to get out of this, I'm sorry. Okay, all right, never mind, we'll just leave it like that. This is really where I wanted to end, which is Jay Krishnamurti, who says that holistic implies a very sane mind and body, a clear capacity to think, and also it means holy or sacred. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to discuss or have any questions and so on. Yes.
How long did you teach at the Krishnamurti school?
Okay, I was in India. I taught for almost 5 years, and then 3 years in Brooklyn.
Okay, so I have a question for you about that. From my understanding, he was about creating a new mind, a new brain, and the awakening of a new brain
Correct.
within. That's what the teachings were all about.
Yeah.
Did you witness that in the schools?
It's a hard thing. I don't think I witnessed it, or if I did, I missed it. I don't know what. Actually, here's the thing. I don't know what that is personally, and I think that what happened is that everybody was trying to investigate what that was. What is that new brain? I think we were always involved in dialogues that had to do with maybe questioning our own images that we were trying to do. I think people were also trying to figure out how can we be aware of our own conditioning? How does that affect our everyday relationship?
But you can ask those questions forever.
Yes. I think you can. So I mean, I actually would invite people from the K schools who have been there to also respond, because this is, I know what you're asking, and I'm afraid I'm not able to give you that good final answer. I don't know. So do you think you have a response that is okay?
For me, to look at students or anyone, myself included, in that way is like, then you begin to judge, is someone advanced, have they evolved, are they that, instead of, I think that it's the encounter with, I hate to use a well-used term, with what is, that is the meaningful exchange where if there's going to be any new mind, it's going to be created right then in just seeing each other. So I would just, I find it dangerous and unhelpful to even go there in that way.
And I don't think we did either, although there was this question at the back of people's minds, maybe, that what are we doing, right? But so yeah, I think that's
Because
to keep that question,
yes,
what are we doing?
correct.
That's
But the whole idea was to create new action, because the old action is a problem. That's what the new brain was supposed to do, or is supposed to do.
Right.
A different action in the world, throughout the world.
Yes, I think though, here's what's interesting. Even when I was looking at what holistic, what did Krishnamurti say about holistic education, and I said, all these, he talked about a sane brain and also non-fragmented. But he also, in that very same talk, actually, he said, what we do know, though, is really a non-holistic brain, a fragmented brain. So let's stay there with that question. So he did say this, but he also said that as a group of teachers, we should stay with where we are, which is a fragmented brain, which is what we know. So that was his response. I think sometimes maybe he was also cautioning us against creating some kind of an idea of what that might be. And instead, even though that is the intention, I think he was also worried that we would look upon it as an end point that we all rush towards, like the goal. So it's a way of keeping it at the back of that question at the back of one's mind, but not necessarily saying there it is, now let's rush there, because we don't know where that is. I think that's
But people in the real world are going to say that's very enigmatic.
It is.
So,
I agree
so
with you.
at the end of the day, what do you really have? At the end of the day, it's a cat chasing its tail.
I wouldn't quite say that, actually. I mean, I think ultimately it was, I mean, I don't know. I can only speak for, what I felt and what I did there. And I think one of the most exciting things about being in a Krishnamurti school is the possibility of that, not only the possibility, actually the creative energy around which we did things. There is, I think in the end for Krishnamurti, really education has to be something very alive. It cannot really be what even this whole idea of whether it is, the new brain or whatever it is, but I think that it cannot be a snapshot or a crystallization of that, but it really has to be something that is ongoing, that is extremely alive. I guess I'm thinking of, think of the time when you felt you really learned something. There's something that happens, when you're really engaged and having to do something with it. So I'm not really, I know I'm not giving you a very good answer here. I wish I could, but yeah.
I mean, I actually think it's a very interesting question because part of the difficulty here is that we can imagine some perfect state where, according to some set of criteria, we have a transformed person. And then we can compare any real person with our image of the transformed person, right? And part of what Kay's saying is, no, we can't grasp it, right? Anything that you desire, anything that you project is not going to be it, right? So it's not sort of a normal type of, sales pitch where we say, look, I have this product, and, and just see how appealing it is. And if you follow these steps, I'm going to give it to you. If you go to these schools, I'm going to give you this product.
Where
I know he has something to say, and then we'll go back.
I think it's a very interesting question
Yeah.
because it seems like Krishnamurti also was interested to know how this is going to end up in certain way. One time I read that he said, is there any tiger coming out of this school? Or something like that.
Yes.
And so he was very interested in that.
Mhm.
So maybe we can address this, putting as he always wanted to put it in a negative way and say, if there are any student that has the quality of non-fragmentation. So that I think is very relevant in a certain way.
Yeah.
So to see
Sure.
what actually is happening
Yes.
in the real
Yeah.
sense.
So I understand. That's good.
Having met students at Brockwood, from Brockwood in summer year after year, it was quite clear that they were much more aware of themselves, of their lives, what their intentions were, what they didn't want. They were very different from public school kids who were looking for colleges so they could drink and gamble and have sex and so on. At least many of the students went different places all over the world and learned even more and shared in other schools. But they were quite self-assured, they were quite aware, they asked many questions, they had thought seriously about what they wanted to learn in university. And they were so mature already at the young age, before they even got to the university, they were what Christian used to call serious about life.
Yes.
I thought the point you made about being aware of what is, fragmented mind rather than having some preconceived idea of the other was good. But I like the historical context of that, and I was wondering how you saw the some of the 19th century attempts at that, like Alcott, I believe the father of the Little Women author, was involved in some sort of a new school conception and all that, which I think Emerson was aware of and all of that. And I was wondering what you knew about that and how that fits into.
I do not know enough about that to be able to say I know you're talking about Bronson Alcott, and he did have a few. He had 5 children in that particular school that you're referring to, and he actually was very interesting. He was the first person to introduce one little black child into that school of his. And because, you know, and people actually objected strongly to that at that point, that that he did that, but he continued. But I don't know enough about, you know, to be able to put that into that kind of historical context.
I know in the 19th century, a lot like
Yes, there were quite a few.
like you read in Dickens and,
Yes.
and Charlotte Bronte, these schools that were, you know, horrible, you know, just inculcating,
Yeah.
you know, who are the kings and that sort of thing, and then you have, you know, so there was a reaction, I guess, to some of that sort of thing.
That's true, and there were these alternatives, but those alternatives today, I mean, that's where I think it all started to some degree, but today they are sort of really different.
Of course, now a lot of these techniques are
Yes.
integrated into just even public education,
Yes.
that are, you know, but, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, thank you. But I think, you know, I think I know what you're getting at, and I guess one of the only things is that they do get into public schools as techniques, but the point that I guess he always tried to make, and many of these holistic educators, is that rather than a technique, can it be a living thing? You know, that particular way of teaching and learning, can it be something alive? So, you know, I think this is what I tell my students. We all try to do this together in the classroom. Seriously, we don't really. I mean, I even though I am the faculty there and I do arrange things and have this, but ultimately, I think it is trying to create that third thing in the classroom. You know, where you have two people coming in, then you try to together create a third, some kind of a third thing there. And by that, I mean that, you know, the two people who come together try to create a third. You know, it's not me, it's not that person, but what we bring together in that particular exchange is hopefully something that we can both learn from. And we both feel that, yes, okay, you know, we have moved in some way, or we have learned a little bit somewhere. I think that's really what we attempt. I know Asha has something.
Raji, mine is sort of integrating this, that if you're two people who come from different backgrounds, the student, the teacher, and you and your other faculty person, so you've come with a certain pattern, a certain idea. And if you can get together and go beyond that idea, maybe something new emerges, because then you're present to what is, and you don't know what the future is.
Right.
And then you create, and that's the beauty of something new happening. And the way I see it, if that's possible.
It seems to me,
Yeah.
when I'm reading King on these things, that he said the real culture is not a matter of reading, not even of details, but what he calls the timeless movement to find truth for God. So he points out something which I consider kind of universal man, or if we put in an Indian language, Vishwaman.
Yes.
One more thing, in the definition that you show there of the holistic education methodology, you mentioned clear thinking.
Yes.
And it's in a way paradoxical, because thinking is a question all the time. But maybe that might be not the real depth, but might be an indicator of a certain different brain, as you want it. There's certain clarity in thinking. Of course, it's not enough because the depth has to be there too.
Yeah.
But there might be a way to assess that in a way.
did you say depth or depth?
Depth.
Like deep?
Yeah. But it's close enough.
It could be depth.
I would say depth.
Yes.
Is it possible that he was, the understanding, the general understanding of education is teachers transmitting knowledge to students? And there's a hierarchical relationship, there's a one-way flow of energy. You know, this is the typical understanding, this is the typical model in the world. And the Krishnamurti was perhaps suggesting that that could be a two-way flow,
Yes.
that a lot of, in the process of gathering knowledge, maybe it's also possible to reach states where you don't know. And not knowing gives you a view of the knowledge that is maybe bigger than three-dimensional.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a new way to circle the knowledge and really look at it from so many different ways.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is some of what he was saying. You know, I think he said lots of things, and it's very difficult, I think, for us to sort of bring it down to a few sentences. But I think that's a nice way to. Can I get this gentleman? And then you.
Back to his question,
Yeah.
he was asking, what are the results, the successes? And I've looked at like the renewing capacity of the planet to renew itself in its natural cycle. And then I brought it to my own body and my circulatory system that renews the inner body and all its organs in a 24-hour period. And then I asked, well, can the central nervous system and the brain and mind renew itself? And that question can only be answered individually when we go on that inner journey to discover what's blocking, what's the walls, the barriers that are stopping us from renewing this natural cycle within the brain and the mind. And that really, there is no results. How many? To ask how many have succeeded at the school. It's like a journey, and when a person reaches that point where they go that deep, it'll flower at that point in each person.
Mm-hmm. And it may not be possible to describe it either.
It's indescribable. It's actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can come across people that say, wow, someone that finally is able to, I can talk to about what I've been going through. I've met several people here that have reached that crossroad in their life and they're struggling tremendously.
I think, yes, I think that's I think all of us are to some degree, right? You know, struggling with something or the other. You know, you had something.
Yeah, a practical question. I'm a public school teacher, in fact. And,
you are, okay.
You know, the last several years, the big thing is, you know, that from the top down, it's saying, well, you need to have a student-centered classroom, not this old-fashioned teacher-centered, and, you know, you need to have them doing things and not just the teacher, blah, blah, so on. And now, say you're an honors teacher, maybe you have a small class, so, you know, it's very nice you have them working together, doing all these things and all that, but, and these are self-motivated students. But now supposing, you know, like me, you have, you know, largely remedial kids who have no self-motivation whatsoever. They look to the teacher for all motivation and all that. What advice would you have for having, bringing it to that type of situation that, you know, this idealized child-centered type of thing when you have you know, large groups of the totally non-self-motivated students?
It's hard actually. It's hard. I understand the position that you're in because I go into classrooms like this quite a bit with my students, and I really don't know your situation, but I will say this, that when I have been in such classrooms, there is always a way somehow. And that way, and again, you know, that's why I gave that example of the teacher, you know, one teacher really trying really hard and just not finding that it's really not working, but finding that actually the student was interested in a conversation. So I could talk with you later and give you some, you know, ideas of what to do. But if you think about, but I really think that you know, when you say that a student isn't motivated and so on, it's, you know, it is one of the big things that you need student assent for learning, right?
It's like,
so what is it that they want to do?
So like I covered an honors class, sometimes teachers away or whatever, and so I covered honors class,
Yeah.
and I give them a little bit of general framework and all that, and they're all sitting there working, even going in their little places to sit on the ground or wherever and working, and they're all looking for these things, and they, grasp somewhat quickly what they're supposed to be looking for, and they all working very nicely together, and, they might ask a little advice, what about this and that, and it, it all works very nicely, but that kind of situation I can't imagine, the ones that,
Yeah, perhaps not, you might need a totally different situation.
yeah,
Maybe, depending on the classroom, really, and that particular context. It could be that drama may work, it could be plays, it could be a more oral kind of, thing beginning there. If you have students who are not yet that excited about writing, but I've seen the students, they can write about themselves quite a lot, actually, their own stories. I've had, I did also co-teach a class in a public school some time back when we created a high school magazine for the students, and they were not all, honor students or anything. I mean, none of them were. And so, but they did do columns on fashion, and some people did it on, on what they knew, their neighborhood news was really interesting. But I guess in some ways, I think when I think of holistic educators and what they have to say, they say that really there is something there. What is the kind of knowledge that the child is bringing into the classroom? If we can sort of try to figure that out, we might be able to do something with it. But I also know it's easy for me to say this, and you're in that situation. And so you would need a few people around you as well who can, who can sort of work on this together. That's, I think, part of it, because I know with my students who are public school teachers, I've actually, we have created a kind of a network where groups of people try to brainstorm and figure out what we can do, and they come up with really wonderful ideas. That kind of this high five idea is one such. The students brought up, we can teach you how to do this. Okay, fine. They were not really, they're not really top of the line students or anything, or I mean, in terms of tests and all, but they did a brilliant job, I think, Good.
I mean, one interesting idea would be if we could begin to create a network that maybe starts with the network you've already created, and have something online with resources, some way to formulate the kinds of constraints that people work under, because of course thousands of people in your position, and hundreds of thousands of children, right? And where can one even begin, right? To find resources to begin to deal with this in an intelligent way, right? Maybe when you're in an environment where you don't have a lot of support, your colleagues maybe don't see the
That's exciting.
So that can be done, actually, and I think sometimes it's also, just as much as we want students to be heard, I think teachers feel very, sort of a voice in the wilderness when they are trying to say what they want to, what they feel, right? And everybody says, come on, no excuses, get it done. So it's, so yeah, I think that's an idea. I think sometimes we have something to, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, we'll go ahead, please.
Oh, was there somebody else?
Yeah. Parents send their children to Krishnamurti schools so that they learn a different way of thinking and learning.
Right.
And after some time they go back to their homes.
Correct.
They come from very, very, very different religious backgrounds and vegetarian, non-vegetarian. So doesn't that confuse the child? In school in certain length of time, this is what we feel. And you go home, the parents may not be involved as much as what is taught in school. Different religious backgrounds, the vegetarian, non-vegetarian, all that stuff. Does it not confuse? How do you deal with that?
I think there are teachers here who probably can, parent teachers. I'll tell you what I know about Chennai. When I was teaching there, I think there was a very strong emphasis that the parents were very much interested in the Krishnamurti teachings. And unless they were clear that this is what they were being asked to participate in, I think that was one of the biggest criteria for taking a student. But you must also understand, this is an ongoing, there's always a dialogue, right? And there's always a kind of negotiation between the school and parent. Just like, because they are also part of the community. So in India, that issue was not so much in terms of vegetarian, non-vegetarian. The issue really came up in terms of, when it was time for the student to take some exams as they went on, because the school did not really emphasize, this kind of comparison or competition. But, and so there were no exams, at least till the 9th grade or 10th grade, or, when they have to take these public exams, right? These, state level exams. So that is when you suddenly heard from the parents that, oh, come on, my kid has to do really well. And what are you going to do? So but it is a negotiation, I think. But I think there might be other folks here in the class, here in this particular room, who are dealing with this on an everyday basis, of what happens when the child goes home to a different atmosphere.
It can be a religious background.
Correct,
A very strong religious background. They may not send, but
Yes, so they may not say anything exactly. I think I don't know how you deal with it, but really, in Brockwood, we had them for a longer period of time. Right? So, but in a day school, I would imagine it's more.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge, yes, I would imagine that. Especially if the child goes home and says, well, I'm beginning to question everything you say and do, so that, so that might be an interesting position to be in for the child, right?
Because I'd also like to say that, we talk about Krishnamurti schools and as if they're
not all the same,
They're not all the same, because if you have a school that is a boarding school, that's just a high school, that's different from having a day school that has very young kids as well as older kids. That's different from being situated in India where, Krishnamurti's name, doesn't trigger the same thing that sometimes it does here in Southern California or in England. There's all these differences that are amongst the schools. But I think that within the school, what's important to me is that it isn't just a fixed thing. Like, this is what happens in the school, this is what happens. It's fluid. So I think that's what you were already mentioning. It's this fluidity in these conversations that are ongoing all the time, never ending. You never get to a point where, now we know what we're doing and we're all together. It's constantly. It's this very complicated, complex organism that's happening all the time. And the point is just to be attending to that moment to moment every day where the aliveness is without ever reaching anything.
And also you mentioned about grading, right? Grading. And if you see the Krishnamurti videos where he has children around him, they are questioning him,
Yes.
They are questioning him, and that means it's coming from somewhere. How do we prove that we are there? The Krishnamurti trying to constantly is like, listen to me, that's like,
Yes, I think that grading is a little bit different from giving feedback, though.
Feedback,
It's perfectly fine. I think,
that video when you see that children are questioning him.
Yes,
saying,
yeah.
Why shouldn't that be graded?
Correct. And this is what that is so interesting, because if you walk into it's always interesting to me how kids push back, right? Or rebel, in a school where you have no grading, they say, why not, And in a school where you have a lot of grading, they say, why are you grading me, So it is, I think as a teacher, you're always in a position of having to sort of sort that out with this.
I have a question. You're no longer teaching at any Krishnamurti school.
No,
because it's, and you talk about Krishnamurti and the holistic education, and considering that Krishnamurti was interested in not only this dynamic and all the about holistic education, but the setting was important too.
Mhm.
And my question: what reservation do you have to no longer teaching in a setting that is related to Krishnamurti schools? And you have this in your new setting. Do you have a support that include the setting that Krishnamurti advocated for a holistic education?
It's a very, it's a good question. I'm actually teaching at university, and the university, has its own culture in some ways, right? And one of the things is there is a certain freedom. There's a lot of freedom in terms of what I want to teach, what I want to also think about. So there is that kind of setting in that sense. There is nobody, breathing down my neck saying, why aren't you doing this today or tomorrow? There are certain things we do have to do, but in terms of, I think in some ways, having lived in the Krishnamurti, let's say in that atmosphere, if you will, for a long time. I heard K when I was 16 for the first time. And so there has, I think one carries that to some degree, but also I have people I can talk with who are still very much part of the Krishnamurti circle, if that makes any sense. I don't know. It makes a difference, I think, to have that, to be able to be on the same kind of wavelength. So I have a wavelength with my colleagues, which is fantastic and good and very exciting and all the rest of it. But I think there is a slight difference when when I do talk to others who are either holistic educators or people from the Krishnamurti backgrounds, because we then can. Because then you know that you're really serious about some things, hopefully. You don't know, but you sort of, there's a certain taking for grantedness there.
So you presented, these three sort of
Yes.
holistic, innovative
educational
traditions that all have their sort of origin in some ways in the Theosophical movement. When you think of something like a origin, for instance, both certainly in the Steiner schools, there's quite a bit of authorities, quite a bit of stuff you're supposed to just take on faith, as it were, right?
Yes.
In terms of holistic education, could you say something about maybe some kind of trade-off between the sort of dialogic question that you've suggested as a characteristic of the case schools versus a more sort of method that does lend itself, for instance, to rolling out thousands of Montessori schools, thousands of Steiner schools.
Correct.
Right?
There is that trade-off because you had a curriculum, right? I mean, I think the fact that there was a curriculum in place. Waldorf school, recently it came out on CNN. I don't know if any of you saw the CNN ran a little clip on the Waldorf schools saying that, hey, look, here's a school where they don't need to watch TV and they will not be allowed to do anything with technology in the schools. Now we don't, this is very interesting too. And I've spoken to some people from the Waldorf schools about this, and not all of them are thrilled with this because they're like, well, when Steiner was alive, there was no computer. Now there is, and now we still sort of are sitting with this curriculum that says no computers. And it's very difficult. Can you really tell a child today, look, you cannot touch your computer? That's how they even hang out, right? They don't hang out together anymore. They hang out alone on Facebook. So, there is a very different, I think, way of really interacting socially even. So, but they do. So, but there is, I think, as a result, but they do bring out students who are beautiful artists, who really have very good imaginative play, and it's very similar as well. And I think that is very different from doing what I think Kay challenged all of us to do, which is much more difficult. Yeah. So I think that's a good point, yeah.
I guess I've always had a conflict about Krishnamurti's teachings.
Okay.
Because I was a young kid when I first heard him.
Yes, sure.
And the real thing that I didn't understand everything he was talking about.
I still don't, so.
But I did know that he wasn't trying to take anything from me or shove anything down my throat.
Right.
That's what I knew.
Yes.
From the very first time. And which meant that he's trying to create an awakening in you so that you go through life questioning and figuring out your own personal relationship to all things. And that's a lifelong journey. So these teachings aren't something that you can bottle and replicate and all of that.
Yes.
Yet, on the same token,
I think you just answered your own question.
Part of it, I only answered part of it. Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that.
Put it better than any of us were. We were struggling to say this.
But, see, I think the battle I always had in my mind was that he's really the only person who could ever live those teachings. Because most people, they got to work 40 hours a week for 45, 50 years. And balancing what the teachings are all about and living that life, there's a big conflict. He lived that life because that was him. He didn't really have to work in the world 40 hours a week for all those years, although he did work at what he did. So I always have seen the teachings as 75% real and of great value to anybody who ever wants to embrace them. But I also see 25% that's not all that realistic. That's all.
Yes.
Yeah, but Krishnamurti did say if you only got an extra hour in the day, you can go into this. So you can, no matter what your outside life is, you can create a space where you can, really create this kind of thinking in yourself, and it will spread out. Now, I do have a question here. The issue of motivation that he brought up is huge in teaching. And the other one, I think, in the Waldorf school, I got to look that up, it's interesting. The problem of focus, in the classroom. My wife and I are both teachers, and to get to, turn off the cell phone in your mind.
It's very difficult. Yes.
And I remember seeing, I'd go to the Oak Grove and see Krishnamurti talking, and he'd come out and he'd sit, and there'd be this,
silence,
maybe a minute where everybody was, you could just feel, everybody coming to this moment, because that was what was expected, And how do you create that in the classroom these days? Can't. What are you laughing at? Yeah.
It's very tough. It is hard. Yeah. I know what you mean, because I even have some PhD students. One of my students said to me, well, I can't write a paper unless I have the TV on, earbuds, and I am also on Facebook at the same time, and then I can write a great paper. So it's like, really?
So their argument is that you're arguing with their wiring.
No, here's the thing though. I think actually sometime back in Science, they did bring out a very interesting article where they said that all this, what do we call this thing?
Multitasking.
Yes, multitasking is really task shifting. So we are not really, nobody really multitasks, even though, students think they do. And young people do certainly think, and we do too, right? Listening, to the music in the background, or seeing paper or something, and then trying to do 5 different calling and putting on tea. I don't know, but I think people tend to do some of it, and some of it we can get away with. But I get your. I think the point is really it is task shifting, so they don't really. Focus enough, and I think that there is a concern now among educators that that is something that we might be, we need to bring back.
Yeah.
Because
and there is increasing
yes.
proof that it's the illusion of being more efficient, and that it really
Right.
isn't, as you
Right.
say, no, you're instead you're just jumping.
Yes. So, but they can be very focused. Students can be very focused on some things, you know. So if you give them, you know, like they are never not focused on a video game. So they really, I mean, seriously, I mean, if you think about it, even in this context, they're highly focused. They don't want to angry birds, you know. Nobody wants. They don't even want to talk to you. So it's an interesting thing of focus itself.
There's sort of brought up the dialogic question.
Yeah.
I was thinking, and it in a way addresses sort of everything here in my mind. And I was thinking of it kind of as also a monologic question, shall we say. But it's the question, so say, rather than indoctrinating students into that they should be vegetarian or that you shouldn't be religious, that's not the point, but to say, well, what is it to eat meat, for instance, and what is it to be religious? So that would be, you would be supporting a family in those questions being there, not that a child would go home and say, why aren't we vegetarian, or why are you religious, religion is stupid, but to have that question together. And also the question of, you know, what is it to focus? What is focus? What is it to be on the cell phone? Rather than it be that it's content dependent, shall we say, because times are always changing, and there have always been these, that the mind seeks what people might call distraction, or, you know, for sure you might have said there's no such thing as distraction, there's only attraction. So that if this dialogic, or as it were, you have a 40-day work week, and, you know, even that, and maybe children at home, it's not even that you have an hour, quote, away from something, but in this case, it would be a monologic question, is always alive for you. What is it to be in this 40-hour work week? What is it, my reaction to it right now? So that's just what was coming up for me, this non-content dependent kind of question that we look at our lives with.
Okay. Yes.
But getting back to your question, I remember watching a video of Krishnamurti talking to the Rishi Valley kids, and they were up on the stage with him sitting around. I wish I could remember the year, but we can find it if people want to see it.
83.
Well, there were several.
There are many.
There were several.
It was 83.
But one of the kids was saying, but I have to study hard, I have to pass my tests because I have to get a job.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
Krishnamurti said, well, you know, what if you don't get a job? And he goes, well, then I'll just be a gardener. And something about, well, be a gardener. Well, I won't have money and I'll die. And Krishna said, more or less. So.
Yeah, and that's not realistic.
No, it is.
It's not,
It
not in
is.
the real world.
Well, look.
Not if you have children.
This is what he's inviting us to actually, this is as far as it goes, you know, facing death. So that is the piece that is so huge.
But I disagree with that, because if you have children, are you gonna tell that to your children?
Well,
when you know that when they go out of school, that they have a world to live in, and the only way they're gonna survive is if they earn money. They have to have a job, they have to.
I think actually, you know, can I say that Krishnamurti actually has said many different things at different times. That was one time, but he has also said very clearly that, you know, you do need to have, you can, in fact, I think one of the things I put out here was that the responsibility, that education, not just a job, he said, but also sensitive to the world and so on. That's a function of education. So there were times when he did say that, yes, now go ahead. In some ways, I don't think he ever separated, you know, life and everything that we live from either getting a job or earning or whatever it is, because people's life circumstances are so different. I think his challenge was really in our own life circumstances, can we keep this question and keep this kind of awareness alive? I think that's really one of the things he was getting at. And I think the point that you're making is that it's hard because I'm doing this 40-hour job and I really don't have a space to really think about that, right? Or question.
It's not only that, it's just how real is it? In the real world that I'm living in, how real are some of these things that he says?
Maybe.
Okay, and yes, you have not yet said a word, please.
Well, I mean, if you think about how real is it to have a real job in the real world, look at our real world. To me, it's we're on the brink of destruction, in so many different ways as a result of participating in this, what it is we're supposed to, in this sense, prepare ourselves for. Maybe we to, I don't think it's a really good idea to perpetuate it,
Well, if you're.
Can we just listen to it?
I think, you created a little correspondence here on what he said to this child, And to me, Krishnamurti opened up a potential discussion with this child. The child was focused on, I have to get a job. And Krishnamurti, with one question, said, what if you didn't? And the kid immediately said, well, I'll be a gardener. Well, if you took an hour and really went into that, what would you have come up with? You might have been a successful gardener. You might have been a happier person. You might not have had kids.
And
He began the investigation there.
And he was 10 years old. He's going to be an astronaut the next, 10 minutes later, right? I mean, this is kids too.
Yes, but I think his response was so brilliant because we are so afraid of death.
Right.
And so the possibility to explore the fear of death is a true gift. The death it's part of life. And so to inherit that fear of death.
So can we just hear from Asha? Asha, what you saying? Sorry.
Just in response to, if you're working 40 hours a week, it doesn't mean that you have to divorce yourself from your process of living. If you're thinking and not being present to what you're doing in your work, and if it awakens your awareness to the moment, your 40 hours of work will also be maybe happier. So the question is, are we able to attend to what we're doing, not dividing our life into 40 hours and 1 hour of thinking about these things and 40 hours of doing a hellish job, then it will be hellish because we're doing it without thought. I don't know, that's what comes to mind.
I know one person here, and I think we have to probably end. You are going to have the last word. So, am I right? Is it time? Yeah. Yes, please.
I was observing myself, and I think that when we object about our ways of life, we can go to that point to reach what Krishnamurti said or whoever says something is important. We want to be reassured by the group or by somebody that despite that what we do in life, we still want to reach that, or maybe it's an excuse not to reach that, because in reality we always think about reaching something, about going there. So if we are here doing this is totally opposite what going higher or going there. So we want somebody to reassure us that despite what we do, we're going to reach there. So, and if not, we never reach that point, we never understand, it's because the world we are involved, whatever we do. So it's because we always think in terms of going somewhere.
Well, in all fairness, since you started this, would you want to have the last word? And then
I'm okay. I think everybody's hungry.
Everybody's hungry. Let's go there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Create